A museum for Rachel Carson, and is an expert or a dedicated
Not an expert.
Enthusiast.
Yeah,
of Rachel Carson and her life and legacy.
Yes, happy Women's History Month. And thanks everyone for being here for our Neighbors of the Northwest Branch annual meeting. And for this portion where I get the very awesome opportunity to reacquaint you with a very special part of the Northwest Branch watershed history, the life and lessons of Rachel Carson. I think we could spend the entire time just talking about the final chapter of her life, that was Silent Spring and her public defense of it. But I also think that she's maybe best remembered and offers the most impactful gifts to us when we widen that lens and hold up her work in its entirety, including and especially her decades of writing and research, the bulk of her career that was focused on the wonders and science in nature. So it was that respected career and a beloved body of work on the sea that gave Carson this platform and audience that was willing to receive Silent Spring, that was published almost 60 years ago today. And just a quick note that I'm going to offer a defense that I know I'm not supposed to be dumping lots of text into PowerPoint slides. That's a big no-no, but some of these slides will be text heavy because we're talking about a writer, and it's her work. Her work was her words. And so this will give you a chance to see kind of the substance of her work. So just a quick overview here of what we'll cover in the next few minutes through the life, or her life through her written words. A brief biographical overview. Then we'll move on to explore just briefly some of her most important work as a writer, both for the Fish and Wildlife Service and also in her personal career. And then we'll talk a little bit about her life here in Montgomery County, how it influenced her and how she influenced it. And then we'll finally just talk about her legacy here locally, currently, and into the future. So a brief look at Carson's early life. She was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania in May of 1907. It's a town near Pittsburgh. She had two siblings, but they were much older than she was, and that gave her a lot of one-on-one time with her mother, who was a former teacher and a person that had a deep interest in what was called the nature study movement, that really advocated for positive nature experiences early in a child's life, and to kind of nurture a childhood with nature that would help the child understand the world and grow affection for nature, and also develop a sense of stewardship. Carson's family were not well off, and they often faced uncertainty and struggled throughout her childhood and into early adulthood. But her mother really prioritized her education, and she sold the family's china. She taught extra piano lessons and more, just to help Rachel have this opportunity to attend college, which was also supplemented with scholarships. Rachel became enamored with the sea pretty early on in Pennsylvania, and this sense continued through early college at the Pennsylvania College for Women. When she read a poem of Tennyson's, there was a line where she read, "For the mighty wind arises, roaming seaward I go," roaring seaward I go, which kind of flipped a switch that really compelled her to somehow connect her life and her career with the sea, which she does, even though she has not ever laid eyes on the ocean until she's in her early 20s. So this little text here is from something that she submitted to the St. Nicholas magazine for children, and it won a prize. And I thought it did a good job of showing Carson's style here. She likes to talk about using the senses. So you see her here talking about feeling and hearing, I think maybe even smell somewhere. Oh yeah, the fragrant pine needles. And also it's a great example because even at 15, she talks about the cycles of nature. So here you get, she paints a picture basically of the beginning of a day and what signs in nature tell us that it's the beginning of the day, and then through to the ending song, the night song of a vesper sparrow. So I love that piece and think it holds true to a lot of her style and substance for the rest of her career. So after graduating with a degree in biology, which she'd switched from English, Carson entered a doctorate program here in Maryland at Johns Hopkins University. Much of her family moved to Baltimore to live with her, which is not a normal graduate school experience for many of us today. But Carson's family moved in with her, and she had to work part-time to support them. In 1934, she had to leave this program early. She earned her master's degree in marine biology, but wasn't able to go on to get her PhD because she had to work more. And then a year later, her father dies, and that really cements her status as one of the main breadwinners for her family of about 5 at the time. So that was her mother and sisters and nieces. So this same year, Rachel started her career as a federal employee, working as a junior aquatic biologist for the Bureau of Fisheries. She continued to earn money writing about the Chesapeake Bay for the Baltimore Sun. And at the Fisheries Bureau, she writes about the sea and various species. And after some encouragement, she then submits a piece to the Atlantic Monthly that effectively started her personal writing career, really in earnest. So you can see some of that here. And I love this piece. I think that it's very similar to writing that she even puts forward at the end of her life. It's very much, again, quintessential Carson. So I'll read it quickly, but thus we see parts of the plan fall into place. The water receiving from earth and air the simple materials, storing them up until the gathering energy of the spring sun wakens the sleeping plants to a burst of dynamic activity. Hungry swarms of planktonic animals growing and multiplying upon the abundant plants, and themselves falling prey to the shoals of fish, all in the end to be redissolved into their component substances when the inexorable laws of the sea demand it. Individual elements are lost to view, only to reappear again and again in different incarnations in a kind of material immortality, kindred forces to those which in some period inconceivably remote gave birth to that primeval bit of protoplasm tossing on the ancient seas, continue their mighty and incomprehensible work. Against this cosmic background, the lifespan of a particular plant or animal appears, not as a drama complete in itself, but only as a brief interlude in a panorama of endless change. And then in 1937, she moves her family to Silver Spring after her sister dies, and she's left kind of with more responsibility for the care of her nieces, her sister's daughters. So she moves for practical reasons. She moves because her job, even though it's based in Baltimore, she has a lot of work and research to do in DC. And she also moves because it's closer to College Park, where she has part-time work. She says that she no longer wants to spend so much time commuting between all of those places because of money and time. And then also she mentions that she thinks Silver Spring, Montgomery County, would be a good place for her nieces to be educated. So this, the piece here that we have on the screen comes from her work. She wrote a number of articles for the Baltimore Sun, which really helped supplement her income mainly during the 1930s. She had a lifelong fascination with eels that went through graduate school and through many of her sea books later on. But here, again, she's talking about these ancient rhythms, these ancient cycles that we see in nature. And she allows for some mystery to still remain while also giving us the science that existed in that day with regard to the eels. So next, just looking a bit at her work from her time at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was a job that provided her some stability for her family, and very importantly, it gave her infinite sources of material for her personal writing career. She was one of 2 professional women hired by the Bureau, and she rose from junior aquatic biologist, where she was able to use her writing skills and biology background, to then becoming editor-in-chief of all of Fish and Wildlife Service publications. Carson would work during the day and then write for her own writing and books and articles at night and on the weekends. So she was very dedicated, very busy. One of her most important projects at Fish and Wildlife Service was the Conservation in Action series. The first of which I put a quote from the one that's on Chincoteague. I think here she's really artfully, clearly communicating why the refuges were needed, trying to convince those fishermen, hunters, others that this was actually necessary, and that it was in everyone's interest to help preserve not only the declining bird species, but almost just importantly, the habitats upon which they depended. So here she says, like islands standing out of the low marsh areas are the patches of firmer, higher ground, forested with pine oak and carpeted with thickets of myrtle, bayberry, sumac, rose, and catbrier. Scattered through the marshes are ponds and potholes filled with widgeon grass and bordered with bulrushes and other good food for ducks and geese. This is waterfowl country. This is the kind of country the ducks knew in the old days before the white man's civilization disturbed the face of the land. This is the kind of country that is rapidly disappearing. And I also wanted to note this picture that they included in this brochure, in this pamphlet, where I think it kind of speaks to her ability to make something very clear. So why put these refuges where they are? And that is because this is the Atlantic Flyway. Although this flyway has enormous nesting areas, its wintering grounds are very small and lie in a densely settled part of the United States. So I think just with this image and these words, she makes clear the why behind this program, the entire refuge program. So these are her major books that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, especially the last one here, written during her life. Under the Sea Wind was first published in 1941, right before Pearl Harbor. And because of the war, this book did not really have any chance to make any splash, given the circumstances. It was heavily influenced by some of her favorite British authors, and it takes the reader on a journey under the sea that follows the lives and interactions and deaths of a number of creature protagonists. Her essay that we just discussed, Undersea, was really the foundation for this book. So I'm not going to quote out of this book because it's very much in line with what we read earlier. The Sea Around Us was written a decade later. And she sought to explain many of Earth's scientific trends and truths by diving into the cycles and life in the oceans. So this was a much bigger, taller order, much, I think, more complicated task, but one that she was not only able to accomplish, but then it helped really launch her career to a very high level. It was a bestseller for 86 weeks and then won her the National Book Award that year, or the following year, in 1952. It was also important because it allowed for her to reissue Under the Sea Wind, which then also became a bestseller. So with this book, her second book, she really was able to have greater financial security, and she was able to build a cottage on the coast of Maine And it was a place where that she loved. And it was a place that she would spend summers, frequently spend the summers there, up until she got very ill with cancer, about 7 years later. I'll just finish this part. I was going to do a quote from The Sea Around Us, but I'll just say it also meant that, or this book was also significant because it allowed Carson to quit her federal job and become a full-time writer. So she did resign from her federal job in June of 1952, but then she kept really close contact with her friends and colleagues and was able through them to keep up to date on the most current research being provided through Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, then the last book here in her sea trilogy is The Edge of the Sea, which I think is my favorite. It's philosophically very hefty, and it also kind of combines that heaviness with useful and I think fascinating information, stories about life along Carson's favorite part of the sea world, which is the shore, a very dynamic place. If you have the chance to read her last chapter, I think it's just 2 pages. It's called The Enduring Sea, and it's a very profound piece, and it's her last words on the sea in book form. I'll also say here, we took this book to the beach with us last year to the Delaware Bay, and it was pretty amazing how useful it was, and inspiring. We found these beautiful trumpet worms, or they're shells or tubes, that they make with sand that we read about in her book, The Edge of the Sea. And we spent a lot of time watching the horseshoe crabs. And then something else that we'd read about was the eggs that the horseshoe crabs lay in the sand. So here in this middle picture, you can actually see the different stages of horseshoe crab egg development. The ones that are more translucent are ones that are a little bit older. And then you see that there are some opaque ones that have just been laid, but it was a really nice companion to have this book on our little trip with the kids. Okay, well, that brings us to Silent Spring, which is a book that likely most of us here know about. And it's the story that Carson, who was, for the most part, a quiet and modest and not very controversial writer, felt compelled to tell and defend even when battling cancer. It sparked our environmental movement, critical environmental and conservation laws, and the creation of the EPA. And as I mentioned earlier, it's celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. So her concerns about indiscriminate pesticide use were very clearly communicated here. And then almost just as importantly afterwards, she really spent her time and mental energy and physical energy defending the research and writing that is in this book until she died in 1964. Here, the quote that I wanted to take us into is not one that I see quoted a lot, but one that I thought gave a good picture of her skill in, again, trying to appeal to rational thinking and to kind of the laws of nature, and really making her case as to why one of the points in her case as to why indiscriminate pesticide use was not a smart idea. But she says, the rapidity of change and the speed with which new situations are created follow the impetuous and heedless pace of man rather than the deliberate pace of nature. Radiation is no longer merely the background radiation of rocks, the bombardment of cosmic rays, the ultraviolet of the sun that have existed before there was any life on Earth. Radiation is now the unnatural creation of man's tampering with the atom. The chemicals to which life is asked to make its adjustment are no longer merely the calcium and silica and copper and all the rest of the minerals washed out of the rocks and carried in rivers to the sea. They are the synthetic creations of man's inventive mind, brewed in his laboratories and having no counterparts in nature. To adjust these chemicals would require time on the scale that is nature's. It would require not merely the years of a man's life, but the life of generations. And then I also wanted to include a quote or something that she wrote in a letter that I think really speaks to her sense, what compelled her to kind of step a little bit out of her comfort zone, to not just write about beauty and kind of more general science, but to call out a major problem that she saw. And she said, "Last summer, I said I could never again listen happily to a thrush song if I had not done all I could. And last night, the thoughts of all the birds and the other loveliness that is in nature came to me with such a surge of deep happiness that now I had done what I could. I had been able to complete it, and now it had its own life." So just going back to that quote, I think it also really speaks to dual focus of hers on wonder and kind of caution or action. So the wonder, the love that she had for nature, for birds, is what really inspired and sustained her throughout her life. But she comes to a point where she realizes if she's not doing all that she can and working to protect those things, then she can't even enjoy that thing that did bring her such peace and joy. So a year after Rachel dies, her publisher releases this is a 1956 article that's released in book form in 1965 under the title "The Sense of Wonder." So the original article from 1956 lays out Carson's philosophy on nurturing wonder for children, a sense of stewardship. This is really focused on her idea that it takes, or this relationship between one child and one adult. It can be a grandparent, it could be a parent, it could be a teacher or a bus driver, some adult that helps to nurture a child's interest in nature, to let that child kind of experience joy in nature. And the other kind of major part of her philosophy that's written in this article is around allowing children to first feel or kind of experience emotion with regard to nature. So the enjoyment of nature, feeling comfortable in nature, and then moving into understanding terms or concepts of what they are seeing or experiencing in nature. Before Carson died in 1964, she said that it would be, quote, "heaven to achieve." Okay, so this is just a really, I think everyone probably heard major messages or themes themselves. So this isn't really telling you anything new, but trying to tie up neatly some of her major messages. And if anyone has messages that they heard or, appreciate in her writing, I encourage you to add it to the chat, although I haven't been monitoring it very much. But again, just touching on what we just spoke about, wonder, this idea that science and the natural world are subjects that anyone can find interest in and seek to understand. So she really saw herself as making science and the scientific world accessible to the minds of anybody. So it wasn't just restricted to universities or labs that those are the people who do science or, who do the studies and research, but that we all have a responsibility to try to understand it. And also, Silent Spring especially talks about technology and whether it's chemical technology or nuclear technology, other things, it shouldn't be blindly adopted. We should always ask questions of how will this impact an entire system, an ecosystem. And then finally, kind of the more philosophical messages that are everywhere in her writing, that life's mysteries remain, but that there are ancient rhythms and cycles and interconnectivity that's across place and time. These are scientific truths, but they also somehow provide us a sense of meaning and belonging. Okay, so this is kind of the fun part to me. And this is the part that Laura with Friends of Sligo Creek worked on, I believe, for years, and has just done such a wonderful job in a service to our community, really, by researching Rachel's life here. So she lived nearly 3 decades in Montgomery County. All but 2 years were spent in Silver Spring. And she moved around a lot because she had a family to care for, with needs of young children and needs of older parents, that multi-generational household that some of us know. So we see here homes in Silver Spring. I was not able to fit on the slide Tacoma Park, so I made a awkward little arrow at the bottom that tries to show where she lived there. And, you can see that she resided in places that were practical for her, that allowed for commuting and school access, but also that were close to some parks and trails. And you can also see that one of her houses, the Sutherland Road, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, that one was demolished to make way for the Capitol Beltway. So next, all of those houses we just talked about were rented. She was not able to buy a house until I believe it was 1956, and then she moved in 1957. She and her mother and adopted son, her grandnephew, moved to the Quaint Acres neighborhood of Silver Spring. This was an important move for them because it offered them more stability and a chance to be in what Carson calls an ideal house, which I believe really meant somewhere with natural light. Carson designed the house herself with her mother and son in mind, giving that special attention to natural light in the house, but also natural beauty outside. And she made an effort to add to that beauty by gardening, but also leaving a large portion of this land wild for wildlife like birds and frogs in particular. I love the word the term that she gave to this piece of her land. She called it the wild tangle. And I just love that. So this house and its intentional design, I think is very special. I think it should be kind of considered another piece of Rachel Carson's body of work because she really did help to design it. And it's also important when she was living there and finally a homeowner, she was able to engage the neighborhood association and try the homeowners association and try to convince homeowners to not spray indiscriminately pesticides. And I believe she was able to convince them of that. And here are some bluebells too that she has in her front lawn. Okay, one piece that I wanted to mention of her community here locally was the Audubon Society of the District of Columbia, which changed its name in 1960 to what is currently the Audubon Naturalist Society. So it was one of the most important parts of Carson's community here. It gave her friendships, it gave her social activity, although she seemed to really focus on those activities that were only focused on nature. So she wasn't as into hosting parties through the society as some of the other folk were. It was also a group for her to share information and ideas, and where she could receive those same information, ideas in return. And the members of ANS at the time were very active. They were scientists, government officials, lifelong students that were just filled with curiosity and a desire to protect what they loved. She joined ANS in 1945 and was a board member there for a total of 7 years. She was a contributing editor to the magazine, where she also wrote and reviewed books, nature and science books, and then she becomes an honorary vice president. And I think really when you look at, I spent time reading through these old magazines, I think they were quarterlies then, and it's amazing the topics that were discussed, the work that ANS was working on and how it really overlaps with Carson's interests, particularly those related to ecosystem destruction or degradation, and then synthetic pesticides. So I don't want to spend too much more time reading, but this quote here at the bottom I thought was really nice. There was a issue of the Naturalist, or of the Atlantic Naturalist, that came out. It was to be published like the week that she died, so they quickly wrote this for that issue. Only a few of us perhaps realize what a vital and continuing influence she has been in setting the goals which this Audubon Society in its recent years has sought to attain. In countless quiet words of advice and encouragement, in the clear and inspiring way in which she could make complex matters seem coherent and different problems possible to overcome, she has steered us towards larger horizons that have made the journey an adventure. If we've printed anything of real value in these pages since 1948, it has largely been through following her suggestions and profiting from the knowledge that she so generously gave. All right. So now just kind of briefly touching on her local legacy as it is today. This was a picture of a bald eagle I took at Four Corners here in Silver Spring, kind of close to the intersection. But of course, this bald eagle we might not see bald eagles anymore if it weren't for Carson's work on DDT in particular. So that's kind of one of many, many living legacies that we have here locally. Kind of institutionally, there's now the Rachel Carson Landmark Alliance, which is run by Diana Post, Dr. Diana Post. Diana and her husband Cliff also own the Berwick Road House. They help run a contest called their Wonder Contest, where they have intergenerational teams of children and adults writing about wonder throughout the world. So they get submissions from South Korea and Germany and then, Silver Spring as well. And RCLA is also a good contact for current research on pesticides. There's also the Rachel Carson Council, which helps to bring her advocacy to a national audience today. And then Montgomery Parks has done a good job of naming a number of places. The trail along our Northwest Branch, part of it is named after her. A beautiful park in Brookville, Maryland, and then a small park in downtown Silver Spring. And then finally, since we won't really talk much about this, but I'm happy to answer questions later. But as Anne mentioned, we are trying to create a place here, an adaptive reuse of this empty building here that sits along the Northwest Branch and right next to a bus stop and on a major road. It would be a community museum that would really be welcoming, welcome the community to nature, to our local ecology, to Carson's work, to Native history and perspectives along and around the Anacostia watershed. It'd also give groups like Friends of Sligo Creek or Neighbors of the Northwest Branch somewhere to meet. So having meeting and event space, and we would fill the area with native gardens. It's a 2.74 acre property that, especially since it is in a stream buffer area, it would be great to remove some of the invasives and fill some of that lawn with native gardens. And we'd also provide wheelchair accessibility both in the building and those gardens, and then also try to build an accessible overlook to see the beautiful falls and the boulders that are part of, or kind of evidence of, the fall zone that the building is right next to. So the point would really be to bring that accessibility of nature and science that Carson sought through her writing into a more physical form. And that is it. I'm happy to, if people have questions or if anyone just wants to correct me or discuss anything, I am just happy that we had this chance to talk about someone who I think should be talked about a lot more here in this area. I think she's a great hero to have.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. Let me put my... the controls keep disappearing. There. That was wonderful. Wonderful, Rebecca. Are there questions? If you have questions, stick your hand up. If you would like to ask a question, why don't you raise your hand? Inspirational. Yes. We got to thank you, Rebecca. Have to leave early, but so appreciate your sharing your love and knowledge of Rachel Carson. And you've inspired me to read more. That's Janice. Okay.
I wanted to include some books, both for children and adults to read, but I forgot to include that. So maybe we could send out as part of an email afterwards a nice, healthy list to keep people occupied. And
I would love both of those, especially children's book recommendations, as we try to inspire that sense of wonder in our kids. So,
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Nora has her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering. There was that publication mentioned about from the ANS. Does that still is that still being published these days?
It is. It's definitely a different form now. So then it published. I remember reading one title, "Research for All." So it was really important back then as a source of research and documenting birds and bird sightings and trying to look at trends and other things. So that part of it doesn't really happen anymore with the publication that ANS puts out. It's called the Naturalist Quarterly, is ANS's publication now, but it's still very good. It still has book reviews and other mainly local conservation focused information. Kathy's question about that publication as well. I'm actually thinking of asking ANS, I work there part-time, but to see if I could try to digitally archive them, because there's so much good stuff. I am a history nerd and nature nerd, but I think that there's some really amazing stuff in there. That's local history and also national and international history, when you think that the people who were involved there were also involved in making policies at the federal level. And it's really neat to see some of the articles there, at least for me.
I see there are some questions about the status of the building.
Yes. So, the status of the building is that it's owned by Montgomery Parks. They are open to receiving our proposal, but the proposal needs to include lots and lots and lots of information that would be gathered by us hiring an architect and a civil engineer, which we did a month ago. And we've been to countless meetings now with really expert people throughout the state and county, flood experts, dam experts, traffic experts. So trying to cross off all of these kind of permitting questions, other regulatory questions, before we get a thumbs up, I think, from Parks. The other major part of that is finding the money to do that, the short-term money to keep ourselves afloat, to be able to keep paying the architect and the engineer, but then eventually we'll need the money to build the building, it's the same building, but to do the adaptive reuse project. The building is in very bad shape. It has lots of asbestos and lead. It's a hazard for many reasons as it stands now decaying next to the Northwest branch. So what we would do is, I think, a community environmental service to really put love and care into this building that was once an industrial building. It was part of the old water filtration site. So,
are there other questions? Raise your hand. Oh, well, taking another one from the chat. Alexi asks, is anyone from Carson's family involved?
That is a great question. At this point, no. So she doesn't really have an extensive living family, but most everybody else. And one thing I really should have mentioned about local legacy was that her biographer, Linda Lear, is also local. She wrote Carson's most substantive biography, and then also the biography on Beatrix Potter. She lives in Bethesda. So people like her, she's involved. Diana Post, who owns her house now, is involved in that she, is supportive, knows about the project at least. But her adopted son, I've not reached out to at this point because I'm not. I just haven't yet. I don't feel like we're kind of at that point where it seems like anything will certainly happen. So, but definitely we will at some point.
What about the nieces?
So the niece that was Roger's mother died, and that's why she adopted Roger. That is a good question about, maybe Laura knows about the other niece. Virginia, maybe, is that her name? I think there's Margie and Virginia, but I actually don't know. Very good question. And yeah, there is this wonderful photo essay that Laura created, and I believe it's accessible on, if you Google it, it will come up, but it is just a treasure because without that, I don't think a lot of us would have known where she lived. I live in Woodmore, and I would not have known that she lived here for many, many years. And I think, again, that was just such a service that Laura did for the community.
Yeah.
Flooding.
Do a clap here for Laura, as well as a clap for Rebecca. Yeah, what about the flooding? Well,
yeah, I'm learning a lot. In the end of the day, we won't put something there, especially that would attract children if it's not safe. So we will scrap the plans if it's not safe. But we're trying to find out if it is. And right now it seems like there are two competing floodplain plans, one that's FEMA and one that's, I think, Parks and Planning. We have to pay to not remediate, whatever the word is, mitigate those discrepancies. I think the FEMA one is, or there's one that shows that the building is not at all in the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, and that one is correct when we did the surveying. But everything else around it floods terribly. So that is a problem. We'd also have to seal the basement of the building because that would actually make it in the floodplain. But the basement really is just a crawl space with some radon equipment down in the basement. So if we seal that at least to visitors, the public, then the floodplain designation also changes. The other major issue is that it is a historic building. So while we're trying to restore it, we have to do so thinking about Georgian architecture. And that is not what I was envisioning at first when I was thinking about putting on a pretty light-filled atrium or something. So we're working with a lot of different competing constraints, and it's a fascinating process, but one that I think we can at least try. We may as well just try to do this, try to give the community something positive and worthwhile to call home, and to learn a little bit in this space and really have it be their space.
Wonderful. That was just a marvelous presentation, Rebecca. Thank you ever so much. Okay, are there any other questions? If there aren't, we can all go and watch the president do his State of the Union.